In June 1907, a horse-drawn stagecoach carrying 250,000 rubles exploded in the central square of Tiflis, the capital of Georgia, as armed men hurled bombs into a crowd of Cossack guards and opened fire with revolvers, killing dozens and seizing the money in broad daylight. The mastermind behind this brazen heist was not a common criminal but a 30-year-old underground revolutionary named Ioseb Jughashvili, a man the world would later come to know as Joseph Stalin. How did a failed seminary student from a small Georgian town become one of the most prolific bank robbers in the Russian Empire? And how did that career of violence serve as a rehearsal for the totalitarian rule he would impose on hundreds of millions of people? To understand how this story begins, you have to picture the Russian Empire at the turn of the 20th century, a place of staggering inequality and simmering revolution. The Caucasus region, Georgia in particular, was a hotbed of radical politics. Ethnic minorities chafed under Tsarist rule. Workers in the oil fields of Baku and the railways of Tiflis labored for pitiful wages while the aristocracy and the merchant class lived in opulence. Into this world, in 1878, Ioseb Jughashvili was born in the small town of Gori to a cobbler father who drank heavily and beat his family, and a devout mother who scraped together everything she had to send her son to the Tiflis Theological Seminary. She wanted him to become a priest. What she got instead was something far more dangerous. At the seminary, Jughashvili was a bright student, but the institution itself radicalized him. The school was run with an iron fist by Russian Orthodox monks who suppressed Georgian language and culture, searched students' rooms for forbidden books, and punished independent thought. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that the young man first encountered the writings of Karl Marx, smuggled into the dormitories in secret. By the time he was expelled in 1899, officially for failing to pay fees but almost certainly for his underground political activities, he had already committed himself fully to revolutionary Marxism. He would never hold a legitimate job again. What happened next is a part of Stalin's biography that Soviet historians worked very hard to sanitize or erase entirely. For the next decade, from roughly 1899 to 1912, the man who would become the supreme leader of the Soviet Union lived as a full-time underground operative, organizer of strikes, propagandist, and crucially, a planner and executor of violent crimes. He adopted dozens of aliases. Koba, after a Georgian folk hero, was the one that stuck longest among his comrades. He moved through the shadows of the Caucasus like a ghost, evading the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, with a combination of cunning, brutality, and an astonishing network of informants and safe houses. The Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, led by Vladimir Lenin from exile in Europe, was desperately short of money. Legal fundraising was slow and unreliable. Lenin, despite his intellectual persona, was pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness about funding. He quietly authorized what the party euphemistically called expropriations, a word that made armed robbery sound like a line item in a budget report. The idea was simple: the Tsarist state was the enemy. Its banks held money that rightfully belonged to the people. Therefore, stealing that money was not theft but revolutionary justice. This is a moral framework that would have enormous consequences, and if you are the kind of person who finds the hidden machinery behind Soviet history as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing to this channel. We dig into the real, documented stories that shaped the 20th century, the ones that official histories tried to bury. Lenin needed men on the ground who could carry out these operations, and in the Caucasus he found the perfect instrument in Koba. Stalin was not the only Bolshevik engaged in expropriations, but he became one of the most effective. The network he built in Georgia was extraordinary. He recruited gunmen, bomb makers, and lookouts from the criminal underworld of Tiflis and Baku. He forged alliances with Armenian and Georgian gangsters. He cultivated informants inside the police and the banking system. He operated with a combination of ideological fervor and gangland pragmatism that made him uniquely effective and uniquely terrifying, even to his own comrades. The most famous of all these operations was the Tiflis bank robbery of June 26, 1907, an event so audacious and so violent that it made international headlines and embarrassed the Bolshevik Party leadership in Europe. Here is what happened. The State Bank of the Russian Empire regularly transported large sums of cash through the streets of Tiflis under armed Cossack escort. Stalin and his chief lieutenant, a fearless Armenian revolutionary named Simon Ter-Petrosian, known by his alias Camo, planned to intercept one of these shipments in Erivansky Square, the busiest public space in the city. The plan was not subtle. It relied on overwhelming firepower and surprise. On that June morning, the square was crowded with shoppers, vendors, and carriages. The stagecoach carrying the money, escorted by mounted Cossacks and armed guards, entered the square on schedule. Camo's men were positioned around the perimeter, dressed as ordinary citizens. At the signal they attacked. Bombs were thrown. The first landed under the hooves of the Cossack horses, killing several guards and animals instantly. More explosions followed. The noise was deafening, the smoke thick and choking. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Bystanders screamed and ran. In the chaos, Camo himself leapt onto the stagecoach, seized the bags of money, and escaped in a stolen carriage. The entire operation lasted less than 5 minutes. At least 40 people were killed or wounded, many of them civilians. The haul was approximately 341,000 rubles, an enormous sum equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The money was almost useless. A significant portion of the stolen rubles were in 500-ruble notes, large denominations, whose serial numbers had been recorded by the bank. Lenin's operatives in Europe attempted to exchange these notes in cities across the continent, from Paris to Munich to Stockholm. One by one they were caught. The police traced the notes back to the Tiflis robbery. The scandal was enormous. The Bolshevik faction of the party, which had formally banned expropriations at a recent congress, was furious. Even within the Bolshevik ranks, there was discomfort. Lenin publicly distanced himself from the operation, while privately ensuring that as much of the money as possible was laundered and funneled into party coffers. It was a masterclass in political deniability, a skill Lenin and later Stalin would refine into an art form. Stalin's precise role in the Tiflis robbery has been debated by historians for over a century. Soviet-era accounts either ignored the event entirely or minimized his involvement. Some sources place him in the square that day, watching from a rooftop. Others suggest he coordinated the operation from a safe distance. What is not in dispute is that he was the chief organizer of the Caucasus expropriation network and that he personally selected and briefed Camo for the mission. Declassified Okhrana files, examined by historians like Simon Sebag Montefiore in his landmark book Young Stalin, confirmed that the Tsarist secret police considered Jughashvili one of the primary architects of revolutionary banditry in the region. They tracked him obsessively, and yet for years they could not hold him. This raises a deeply uncomfortable question that historians have wrestled with. Was Stalin himself an Okhrana informant? The evidence is circumstantial but persistent. He was arrested and exiled multiple times between 1902 and 1913, yet his sentences were consistently lighter than those given to comrades involved in similar activities. He escaped from exile with suspicious ease on multiple occasions. Some researchers have pointed to Okhrana documents that appear to reference a highly placed source within the Bolshevik underground in the Caucasus, a source whose profile matches Stalin's. Others argue that these documents are forgeries or misinterpretations. The truth may never be fully known. What is certain is that Stalin survived the underground years when many of his contemporaries did not, and that his survival owed something to a talent for manipulation and betrayal that would later define his rule. The Tiflis robbery was not an isolated incident. It was one operation in a sustained campaign of revolutionary crime that Stalin directed across the Caucasus for nearly a decade. There were protection rackets targeting factory owners and oil barons. There were kidnappings for ransom. There were armed attacks on money transports and post offices. In the oil boom town of Baku, Stalin organized workers' militias that also functioned as criminal gangs, blurring the line between political activism and organized crime in a way that would become a template for revolutionary movements worldwide. He extorted money from wealthy Azerbaijanis, intimidated rivals within the party, and ordered the murder of suspected informants. The level of violence was extraordinary, and the young Stalin showed no hesitation in deploying it. Consider this pattern interrupt for a moment. The man who would preside over the industrialization of a continent, who would command armies of millions, who would sit across the table from Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta and Potsdam, spent his formative years as essentially a gang leader. This is not metaphor or exaggeration. It is documented fact. And the skills he learned in those years, the capacity for secrecy, the instinct for identifying and exploiting human weakness, the willingness to use violence as a first resort, rather than a last one, the talent for building networks of loyalty based on fear and mutual complicity, These were the exact skills he would deploy in his rise to absolute power. By 1912, Stalin had caught the attention of Lenin himself, not just as a useful enforcer, but as a political thinker. Lenin brought him into the Bolshevik Central Committee and gave him the task of writing a theoretical essay on the nationalities question, the problem of how a Marxist state should handle its ethnic minorities. Stalin wrote Marxism and the National Question while living in Vienna in early 1913, and the work impressed Lenin enough to cement Stalin's place in the inner circle. It is a strange irony that Stalin's ticket to the highest levels of revolutionary politics was an intellectual treatise, not a bank robbery. But without the robberies, without the money they funneled to the party, and the reputation for ruthless effectiveness they built, Stalin would never have been in a position to write that essay or to gain Lenin's trust. The arrest came in February 1913. This time the Okhrana was thorough. Stalin was betrayed by Roman Malinovsky, a Bolshevik Central Committee member who was without question an Okhrana double agent. Stalin was sent to exile in Turukhansk, a remote settlement in Siberia above the Arctic Circle, and this time there would be no easy escape. He spent 4 years there, from 1913 to 1917, living in brutal conditions, hunting, fishing, and reading, cut off from the revolutionary movement. He fathered a child with a local woman, a relationship about which Soviet historians were unsurprisingly silent. The exile was a kind of death and rebirth. The bank robber went in. The politician came out. When the February Revolution of 1917 toppled the Tsar, Stalin returned to Petrograd and immediately began maneuvering for position within the rapidly evolving Bolshevik leadership. He was not the most prominent figure. Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, these were the orators and theorists who commanded attention. Stalin was quieter, more bureaucratic, seemingly less ambitious, but he understood something that his rivals did not. Power in a revolutionary organization does not flow from speeches, it flows from control of information, personnel, and money. These were precisely the skills he had honed in the Caucasus underground. After the October Revolution and through the Civil War, Stalin accumulated administrative roles that others considered boring, but that gave him extraordinary leverage. He became People's Commissar for Nationalities, then People's Commissar for Workers' and Peasants' Inspection, and most critically, General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. Lenin, by then increasingly ill, began to realize too late what Stalin was doing. In his final testament, dictated in late 1922 and early 1923, Lenin warned that Stalin had concentrated immeasurable power in his hands and urged the party to find a way to remove him from the General Secretary position. The testament was suppressed. Stalin's allies ensured it was never read to the full party congress. The bank robber from Gori had outmaneuvered them all. What followed is one of the most chilling consolidations of power in human history. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Stalin systematically eliminated every potential rival, every independent voice, every person who knew too much about his past. Trotsky was expelled, exiled, and eventually murdered with an ice axe in Mexico in 1940. Kamenev and Zinoviev were executed after show trials in 1936. Bukharin, once called the darling of the party, was shot in 1938. Camo, the fearless bank robber who had carried out the Tiflis heist, had died in a suspicious bicycle accident in Tiflis in 1922, conveniently before he could become a liability. Dozens of old Bolsheviks who had known Stalin in the underground years were swept up in the Great Purge. The witnesses to his criminal past were being erased. Here is another pattern interrupt worth pausing over. In the archives of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, researchers have found evidence that Stalin personally reviewed lists of people to be executed, sometimes annotating them in his own handwriting. In a single day, November 12, 1938, Stalin and his then henchman Vyacheslav Molotov approved the execution of 3,167 people. This was not the impulsive violence of a bank robber. This was industrialized murder, carried out by a man who had learned decades earlier that violence is a tool and that moral restraint is a weakness to be exploited in others. The connection between Stalin's criminal youth and his dictatorial methods is not merely thematic, it is structural. The Bolshevik underground operated as a conspiratorial organization where loyalty was enforced through fear, where information was compartmentalized, where betrayal was punished by death, and where the ends always justified the means. Stalin internalized these principles completely. When he built the Soviet state, he built it on the same model. The Communist Party under Stalin functioned like an enormously scaled-up version of a Caucasus revolutionary cell, with the same paranoia, the same secrecy, the same willingness to sacrifice individuals for the supposed good of the collective, and the same absolute authority vested in a single leader who trusted no one. The question of whether Stalin was actually a bank robber is, in one sense, trivially easy to answer. Yes. He organized and directed armed robberies. He oversaw extortion, kidnapping, and murder. He did these things for years across multiple cities with documented consequences. The Okhrana knew it, the Mensheviks knew it, Lenin knew it and approved. The real question, the one that matters, is what this tells us about the nature of revolutionary power and the kind of men who seize it. There is a tendency in popular history to treat the crimes of revolutionaries before they take power as youthful adventures, colorful backstory, the wild years before seriousness set in. This framing is dangerously misleading. Stalin's years as a bank robber were not a detour from his political career. They were the foundation of it. Every skill he used to terrorize the Caucasus underworld, he later used to terrorize a nation of nearly 200 million people. The scale changed, the methods did not. Consider the parallels. In the Caucasus, Stalin built a network of loyal operatives who owed their positions to him personally and who could be discarded the moment they became inconvenient. In the Kremlin, he did exactly the same thing, cycling through secret police chiefs, Yagoda, then Yezhov, then Beria, each one eventually destroyed by the master they served. In the underground, Stalin controlled the flow of money and used it to buy loyalty and punish disloyalty. In the Soviet state, he controlled the entire planned economy, rewarding compliant officials with privileges and condemning dissenters to the Gulag. In Tiflis, he used informants to identify enemies and preemptively neutralize them. In Moscow, he built the most extensive domestic surveillance apparatus the world had ever seen. Even the language carries over. The Bolsheviks called their robberies expropriations, sanitizing violence with bureaucratic euphemism. Under Stalin's rule, the forced collectivization of agriculture, which caused a famine that killed millions in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, was described as a necessary step in socialist construction. The Great Purge was framed as the rooting out of enemies of the people. The deportation of entire ethnic groups, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, was called resettlement. The instinct to disguise brutality behind ideological vocabulary was something Stalin learned long before he had a state to run. There is one more detail from the Tiflis robbery that deserves attention, because it illuminates something essential about Stalin's character. After the heist, when the 500-ruble notes proved impossible to exchange safely, Kamo traveled to Europe to try to launder them and was arrested in Berlin. He feigned insanity for years, enduring horrific conditions in a German psychiatric institution to avoid extradition and to protect the network. He never betrayed Stalin. When he was finally released and returned to Georgia after the revolution, Stalin greeted him warmly but gave him no significant role in the new Soviet state. Kamo, the man who had risked everything, who had thrown the bombs, who had endured imprisonment and madness for the cause, was sidelined. He died in 1922, run over by a truck while riding his bicycle in Tiflis. Some historians believe it was an accident, others are less certain. Stalin had a long memory and a longer reach, and the people who knew the details of his criminal past had a way of dying at convenient moments. The story of Stalin the bank robber is ultimately a story about the relationship between means and ends, and about the kind of person who thrives in the gap between the two. Lenin believed that the ends justified the means, and he empowered men like Stalin to act on that belief. But Lenin, for all his ruthlessness, retained a capacity for theoretical debate, for entertaining opposing views within certain bounds. Stalin had no such capacity. For him there were no theoretical debates. There was only power, who had it, who threatened it, and what needed to be done to keep it. He learned this not in the libraries of Zurich or the cafes of Paris, where other revolutionaries spent their exile years discussing dialectics. He learned it in the streets of Tiflis, in the oil fields of Baku, in the freezing cells of Tsarist prisons, and in the moments of explosive violence when a stagecoach was torn apart by bombs and a fortune in rubles changed hands. The Soviet Union that Stalin built bore the fingerprints of those early years in ways that persisted long after his death in 1953. The culture of secrecy, the institutional paranoia, the willingness to sacrifice truth for power, the assumption that every relationship is transactional and every ally is a potential traitor. These were not aberrations of Stalinism. They were its core architecture, and they were built by a man who spent his 20s robbing banks, running protection rackets, and ordering murders in the name of a revolution that had not yet happened. So when we ask whether Stalin was actually a bank robber, the answer is not just yes. The answer is that the bank robber never stopped. He simply found a bigger bank to rob. The treasure was no longer gold rubles in a stagecoach. It was an entire country, its people, its resources, its future, and the methods, the bombs, the guns, the betrayals, the bodies left behind, scaled up accordingly. The seminary student from Gori who was supposed to become a priest became instead one of the most consequential and devastating figures of the 20th century, and the path from the seminary to the Kremlin ran straight through the smoking wreckage of Erivansky Square. That is not a metaphor. That is history.